want you to perform with me at the temple tomorrow night. My teacher Patama casually informs me one morning, and it's the scariest 12 words he's ever said to me. The music I've been studying with him, Kendang Arja, demands that two drummers, accompanying singers, simultaneously improvise intricate interlocking patterns over short repeating gong cycles. Patama has taught me just two 4-beat patterns as the basis for these improvisations, only one of which I can actually play accurately at high speeds. And I don't yet understand how to create idiomatic patterns on my own. What's more, I'm playing the higher drum, called the lanang. Now, this is the leader of the ensemble. How can a leader play just two patterns over and over again in a genre that's actually based in improvisation? Unfortunately, Patama is unmoved by my concerns. You'll do fine, he says calmly. Remember, the lanang is the bus driver. So this somewhat mysterious statement offers me very little comfort at the time, but it and others like it will later fundamentally shape the way I analyze this genre. I'm the kind of ethnomusicologist that gets really excited about musical analysis, and especially the musical analysis of improvised forms. I spend a lot of my time in Bali organizing recording sessions with master musicians and then later transcribing all that they've played. All of these are easily archivable materials. But the analysis that I do is very heavily shaped by informal oral music theory, gleaned through long conversations with musicians, as well as by smaller collections of their consciously known drum patterns that they teach me in private lessons, and of course a broader understanding of Balinese music in general. To become a powerful research tool rather than a simple storage facility, then, an ethnomusicological sound archives needs contextualizing. So today I'd like to talk about my research on arja as a springboard for exploring how digital sound archives could complement ethnography-based music analysis. And here I'm not going to talk at all about the potential problems and the limitations of the system. I just want to sort of imagine in my, if I could have it all, dream world, what I would want these archives to do for my research. So in the interlocking drumming for arja, strokes on the higher drum, kendang lanang, intertwine with patterns of like strokes on the lower kendang wadon to create these complex composite patterns. Each drum in the pair has a high ringing stroke, played with the left hand on the rim of the drum. This is called kom on the lower wadon, and it's called bang on the higher lanang. And each drum also has a bass stroke, which is played with the right thumb, called dag on the wadon and tut on the lanang. More often than not, in interlocking patterns, like strokes are paired together, so kom with bang and dag with tut. So here's a simple example of this sort of strict interlocking. In my notation system, O and E represent kom and bang, the high rim strokes, and D and T represent the low dag and tut strokes. And you can see in this pattern that it's a strict alternation between the two drums, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes it's a more complex relationship. It sounds like this. Kom bang de dut, kom bang de dut, kom bang de dut. Now this is a really simple rhythm to play, but only if the piece is pre-composed. And both musicians have been taught their rhythm as part of the interlocking whole. How two simultaneously improvising arja drummers are able to weave their patterns seemingly effortlessly around one another, often at very high speeds, is a completely different analytical question. A friend of mine once jokingly told me that he suspected black magic. A short excerpt of two master drummers will sort of give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. So first I'm just going to play the higher lanang so that you can acclimate yourselves to its timbres and pitches a little bit. You'll also hear some cycle marking instruments, but focus on the drums. So here's a lanang. And here's the lower drum, the wadon. Now I'll play the two of them together. And as you listen, I want you to try to hear the interlocking of these different types of strokes. You've got high ringing strokes, you've got some slap strokes, and then probably the easiest thing to decipher on first listening are the bassy dag and tut strokes. These strokes tease around one another without colliding, but their interactions are not pre-composed. Notice how each musician plays in no preset order, a large variety of different patterns. Sometimes you're going to hear a lot of bass strokes in a pattern. Sometimes you're going to hear not very many bass strokes. Sometimes a dag-heavy pattern is going to line up with a tut-heavy pattern as though they have been planned in advance, but very often they don't. This is totally improvised interlocking. By the way, that's by far the slowest they ever play. So how are they doing it? Simply asking my teachers about their techniques had yielded very little fruit. As in many oral traditions, Kendang Arja does not have a detailed music theory. Aspiring drum teachers learn by watching skilled musicians play at speed, and even in more formalized lesson settings, if such things exist, there's little, if any, explicit technical discussion of the music. Whenever I asked one of my own teachers how he could be interlocking with his partner while improvising at the same time, each kind of told me the same thing. He would say, "Oh, we just play whatever we want to, and you can too." And then I would try, and that would fail. And so I know that that's not something I can take too literally, that idea that you can play whatever you want. But through months of lessons and casual conversations over coffee, certain other information began slowly to trickle out, these very broad guiding principles that would govern the way these masters improvised. Among my many teachers, probably the most universally articulated rule for arja improvisation is that the lanang plays on the beat and the wadon plays off the beat, the high drum on the beat, the low drum off the beat. Whether using the terms ganjil and ganap, or odd and even, borrowing the English language terms on beat and off beat, or referring to the lanang's role of ngematin, or to mark the mat, a regular quarter note beat played by a timekeeping instrument called guntang. These were all different ways to say that, fairly unanimous consensus, the lanang plays on the beat, the wadon plays off the beat. But in reality, actually, both players' hands generally strike their drums contiguously. Every 16th note, everybody is hitting their drum. So what does the rule mean? If you ask a drummer to clarify this, what do you mean the lanang plays on the beat and the wadon plays off the beat? Most of them will go, "Okay, I'll play a pattern for you," and then say, "See?" So that wasn't terribly helpful. So when I started doing analysis of this music, I approached the music with this theory in mind, trying to look at the music and say, are there simple explanations I can make for this idea that the lanang plays on the beat and the wadon plays off? And as I looked through the many, many hundreds of hours of transcriptions, I found that the claims seem to refer to the placement of the high-ringing rim strokes, that the lanang's pung strokes generally land on the beat, aligning with the timekeeper, the guntang timekeeper, and on the half beat, while the wadon's comb strokes generally occupy the 16th notes in between. So the most basic composite pattern that you could imagine for Kendang Arja conceptually is this. Peng, kong, 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 peng. The lanang strikes peng on the beat, peng, 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 and the wadon plays comb off the beat. Gong, 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 gong. Make sense? Cool. In reality, no experienced drummer is ever going to play a pattern this simple, at least not for very long. And so there are lots of different ways that a drummer can vary this pattern while still abiding by this idea of an on-beat, off-beat mandate. Performing experience on the kendang had taught me that when an arja drummer is not playing one of his main strokes, he's going to tap lightly on one of the two drum heads. So he's kinesthetically maintaining running 16th notes all the time. In the basic pattern then, where each drummer appears to rest, the little underscores there, he's actually filling in the spaces with what we would call a counting stroke, just a soft subordinate stroke in the right hand. And that's shown with the stars there. So the simplest variation on the basic pattern would be to replace one of these left-hand rim strokes, these kom or peng, with a softer subordinate stroke in the left hand instead. And this can be done symmetrically, like this first wadon pattern that you see here, the gong, the gong, the gong, the gong, or asymmetrically, like this. Gong, gong, the gong, gong, the gong, the. And each of these different variants creates its own unique composite when it interlocks with the lanang. So even if you're just imagining it interlocking with the basic lanang that I showed you before, first one sounds like this. Bang, bang, gong, bang, bang, gong, bang, bang, gong, bang, bang, gong, bang. And the second one, like this. Bang, gong, bang, gong, bang, bang, gong, bang, gong, bang, bang, gong, bang, bang. So because the lanang player 2 can replace any of his bang strokes with a counting stroke, we get a total of 65,536 different possible versions of this seemingly simple 4-beat phrase. That's just the beginning. Where this becomes more interesting is when drummers start using double strokes, when they play 2 rim strokes in a row. And when you play 2 strokes in a row in Balinese drumming, it's understood that the second stroke is the more important of the 2. So when this occurs, a really cool thing happens to this on-beat, off-beat rule. It actually gets turned on its head. So Where lanang lines up with the slower beat levels in the metrical grid when single strokes are used, as I just showed you, when double strokes are used, suddenly it's the wadon strokes that line up with the slower beat levels. So instead of having peng, gong, peng, with the peng on the strong beat, you have gong, peng, gong, gong, peng, gong, gong, peng, gong, gong, peng, gong, gong. So these following two patterns here, both feature double strokes marked with stars, and they demonstrate this kind of note placement. Together they create the composite below, which now has the wadon's kom strokes firmly on the beat. It sounds like this. Gong, peng, gong, peng, gong, gong, peng, gong, peng, gong, gong. So obviously this contradictory rule set between single strokes and double strokes creates occasion for like strokes to collide instead of teasing around one another. As we can see in the theoretical combination of the double stroke pattern that we just looked at on the wadon and the basic single stroke lanang. As you can see on the bottom there, it's kind of hard to see, but there's three little red stars in three very important beats. Peng and kom are colliding instead of interlocking. So there's your little red stars down there. Now you might imagine, given what I've just told you about Balinese interlocking, that this is a faux pas. You shouldn't be doing this. But when I asked one of my teachers about it, Cho Alit, he laughed at me. And he said, "This isn't bares, Leslie." Now what he meant was that arja is not precomposed like this very famous Balinese dance piece, bares. It's not meant to have perfect interlocking drumming with no collisions. As long as there weren't too many collisions in a row, drummers listening to recordings of their own playing would be satisfied with a collision here and there. In fact, most drummers from the old generation actually lamented that arja players in the young generation had become too perfect. What was important for these drummers was that the overall impression was one of interlocking. Especially at such high speeds, the details were sometimes incidental, and small collisions of kom and peng could be enjoyed, even wished for. But details become significantly more important, and collisions far less common or seemingly acceptable when I began looking at the bass strokes, the wadon's dag and lanang's tut. And this greater attention to detail, if you know anything about Balinese drumming in general, is not very surprising. Among musicians and dancers, dag and tut are universally understood to be more structurally important strokes than kom and peng. So even in improvised arja, the smooth interactions of these strokes is key to a satisfying performance. So some arja masters that I studied with would even make, even though they're improvising, they would make the dag and the tut elements, the bass stroke elements of their playing, completely precomposed, so as to avoid any unwanted collisions. Excuse me. Tuta Vapuan and his partner, for instance, always cycle through the same 4 patterns, always in the same order. They use a lot of this kom and peng variation that I talked to you about just a minute ago, but placement of dag and tut is utterly fixed, as you can see here. And I'll just play you what that sounds like. So improvisation in kom and peng, dag and tut is totally fixed. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do-dee-doo gong. De-doo, de-doo, de-doo. De 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 do 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 de do de do de do de do de do de gong. Play it for you one more time. Now, this sort of precomposition in arja is relatively rare, but even when it's not used, dag and tut placement still appears to be significantly more fixed than kom and peng. Lanang player Pat Chop, for instance, never places a tut stroke directly on the beat, and only in very rare, very controlled situations does he place one on the half beat. So here are a couple of his typical patterns, and as you can see, tut strokes are placed on the 4th subdivision of the beat about 80% of the time, on the 2nd subdivision of the beat about 20% of the time. So here's his first beat. Bang, ba-bang, do, bang, do, ba-bang, do. And this really meticulous tut placement allows his wadon partner to, first of all, play a dag on any beat or any half beat without ever worrying about bumping into his partner. And when you analyze his partner's patterns, his partner's wadon patterns, you see that many of the dag strokes do in fact occupy these on-beat positions. So here are 2 of his patterns. First one, gong, da, gong, 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 da, gong. And second, gong, da, gong, gong, da, gong, gong, gong. So dags really on beat positions. But if you look at his partner, this player, Patdewa's patterns, they do exhibit a freer use of dag than that. So in this pattern here, we see dag mostly in their allotted positions, but two dags land on the second subdivision of the beat where those red arrows are, purportedly a spot reserved for the lanang. Sounds like this. Kong dag, 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 kong kong dag, kong kong. And this sort of incursion into lanang territory, it's not a one-off. Wadon players across village styles seem to break the rules or risk collisions in those bass strokes far more often than their lanang partners, and in ways that I hadn't been able to explain using music analysis alone. So now I want to come back to the story that I opened this talk with, and that strange expression, the lanang is the bus driver. It came out during one of my lessons with Patama, and it came out as most of his best information came out with no prodding from me at all. Whenever I asked questions, he'd be like, I don't know, but then information would just beautifully come out when I wasn't looking for it. So he starts, you see, Leslie, the lanang is the leader. He has to communicate cues from the singer to the ensemble. And this was something I already knew. It was one of the many reasons I was totally terrified to play lanang in the temple. The lanang had to be able to stop on a dime. It had to be able to interrupt any pattern you were currently improvising to give cues to the ensemble totally at the whim of the singer. And then Patama continues. He says, the lanang is like the sopir, the bus driver. He's in control of the bus. He has to constantly be watching the road, following it carefully. He can't stray off the road, he can't fool around too much, or the bus will tip over. Then he says the wadon is like the kernet, the baggage handler, who puts the bags on top of the bus. He has more freedom to move around the bus. He can put the bags wherever he wants to. He can hang out with the passengers. To Tama, the wadon is the drum that makes the music come alive. Well, the lanang, he says, always continues in the same way. This is a quote. The lanang has some variations too, he says, but far fewer. And indeed, many studies of group improvised music show that in order for one musician to have ample improvisatory freedom, another one has to provide a framework of stability. So other arja drummers make similar observations. One of the first things that Wayan Sudirana of Ubud taught me, for instance, was that just a few short lanang patterns, really basic lanang patterns, could be paired idiomatically with virtually any wadon pattern, no matter how long, no matter how complex. Like most of my teachers, the lanang patterns that he taught me were all 4 beats long, and all of them appeared to be small variants, the one upon the other. The wadon patterns he taught me, by contrast, were often 8, 12, even up to like 20 beats long, and much more varied and complex than the accompanying lanang patterns. So in other words, improvisations on the lanang were meant to be relatively simple to allow the wadon to have more freedom to take risks. So with that in mind, I want to return to Pat Dewa's relatively free use of dag in that pattern I showed you before. So remember in this pattern at the bottom right there, we see 2 of Pat Dewa's dag strokes, which are supposed to, according to me, land on the beat or on the half beat, instead landing on the second subdivision of a beat. Just there. But if we remember that the majority of his partner Cho'alet's patterns on the left here, his tut strokes land not on the second subdivision, but most of them land on the 4th subdivision. We know that Pat Dewa is still fairly safe in this dag placement. And then further, most of his partner's second subdivision tut strokes usually occur late in the cycle, like that. So if Pat Dewa uses that subdivision early in the cycle, he's still fairly safe. The relative rigidity of Pat Chot's or Cho'alet's tut idioms and Pat Dewa's familiarity with them allows the latter increased flexibility. So there are all these different stroke placement strategies that come into Kanang playing, but there are also aesthetic guidelines that help shape pattern composition. And again, this is information that sort of slowly comes out if you talk to drummers a lot. As I mentioned earlier, arja, like much Balinese music, is underscored by cycles of repeating cycles of various different gong strokes. And the end of each cycle in almost all cyclic Balinese music is marked by the most important of these gongs. And to emphasize this, Balinese music is often composed with a feeling of leading to the gong, or what is called ngegongin. So Michael Tenzer studies gamelan gongkebyar, and he examined melodies for their kinetic qualities. And he compared ngubang, or static, with majalan, or dynamic moments within melodies. And he noted that gong strokes and other important cyclic markers, quote, exert pull or gravity on melodic motion, causing the regions that lead up to them to be more majalan, or more dynamic. Many arja patterns likewise appear to show increased activity, and particularly important, actually increased dag and tut strokes as the cycle progresses, leading to the gong. So in this 8-beat pattern that you're going to see in a second from Pat Tama, we see that each quadrant of the phrase exhibits increased use of main strokes. There's 3, 4, 6, and 6 respectively. And particularly through the second half of the pattern, you're going to see more tut strokes being used. And this densification of main strokes approaching gong, it exists in these longer cycles, 8-beat cycles. It also exists in shorter cycles. So here are 2 typical 4-beat lanang variants from Cho'alit that both show main stroke use and tut density increasing as you approach the gong at the end of the cycle. So densification is one kind of ngogongin, one kind of emphasizing the gong, but there are other kinds. In some gamelan genres, specific patterns are used to prepare structurally important moments in a cycle. So for instance, in the long pengawat cycles of the famous legong dances, the final gong stroke is generally preceded by a stock standard cadential motif in the drums. And this motif is recognizable as a signpost, both to musicians and to dancers. In arja, of course, we don't have 256-beat cycles like you do in legong. You have 2-beat cycles and 4-beat cycles and 8-beat cycles. So there's not enough space for a big extensive cadential gesture. But the wadon player still achieves this sort of signposting ngogongin simply by playing dag on the beat directly before gong. And then for further emphasis, he's going to follow that up with soft counting strokes or even with rests, which are virtually non-existent elsewhere. As I told you, they're basically playing running 16 notes. So the semi-composed patterns that I talked to you about before exhibit this placement, as do many of Pat Dewa, one of the other drummers, improvised patterns. In each case, regardless of cycle length, dag marks the beat just before gong. It ngogongins. Of course, music will seldom so obediently fit into our theoretical categories. And the concept of ngogongin becomes cloudy in relatively short cycles, where drummers tend not to emphasize every gong stroke, but instead emphasize every few cycles. In Pat Tut's patterns, for instance, these pre-composed ones, the third phrase and the fourth phrase are often thought of by drummers as one continuous 16-beat phrase, or alternately, the entire arrangement of 4 phrases can be thought of as a single sentence leading through an increased density of dag and tut strokes over each subsequent cycle to a big sort of finish at the end of the 4th cycle. And this sort of cycle grouping phenomenon becomes exponentially more common and also more complex in shorter 2-beat and 4-beat cycles, where in fact it doesn't appear to be any fixed idea about which cycles should feature this final dag and which shouldn't in improvised performance. So here we can see a small excerpt of an improvised wadon drumming over a 2-beat cyclic structure. And what you're going to see is that the final dags are marked with stars where he's ngogongening. And then you can see above that I've sort of grouped those cycles together so that you can see where each ngogongen happens. And you can see that it's totally irregular and unpredictable. He ngogongens after 2 cycles, then after 1, then after 3, then after 1 again. So this improvisation and others like it seem to demand a more nuanced conception of this idea of ngogongen, which exists in other Balinese genres. And you have to start thinking about it instead, not in terms of single cycles, but flexible meta cycles. And while there's no formal theory to explain a concept like this, my lessons with Pat Dewa offered some corroboration. So this was fairly early in the lesson process, and he had taught me 3 wadon patterns. One of them was 8 beats long, one of them was 12 beats long, and I was cycling them over and over again, and he was playing lanang. And once he was finally satisfied that I could play them well enough, which took a really long time, he upped the ante. He says, oh, you can mix them up, boleh campur campur, he says. And then he demonstrated. He plays pattern 1, then pattern 3, then pattern 2, and then he starts mixing them up in more complicated ways. He takes the first half of pattern 1 and he sticks it to the second half of pattern 3. He takes the last 2 beats of pattern 2 and he just cycles them over and over again. So there it is. Pat Dewa, he teaches his patterns as 8-beat units or 12-beat units. Sometimes he plays them like that, but mostly he conceives of them and he uses them as 2-beat and 4-beat building blocks to be mixed and matched at will or recombined, played independently as the basis for improvisation. So for instance, you could take the first 2 beats and the last 2 beats of a pattern that you've taught me and flip them in improvisation. Or you could mix and match elements of the pattern in slightly more complicated ways, where like the 1 beat of the yellow gesture and the 1.5 beats of pink gesture get flipped and you move a tut stroke a little bit. So you're mixing and matching elements a whole bunch, creating this very new pattern, but because it's built from familiar elements, it's still gonna be able to interlock with wadon. For me, the most exciting thing about being both a field worker and an analyst is that discoveries in one modality can inform and give focus to the other, creating a feedback loop of insight. Only through attempting to perform with these musicians, learning directly from them, and spending hours in their homes discussing music did I slowly stumble upon their ideas about the roles of the drums and their interactions with each other. And these concepts then became a doorway to unraveling the unspoken guidelines of arja performance practice. So how does all of this relate to digital archiving? I'm not an archivist. A lot of ethnomusicologists have large collections of field recordings, we know this. Of course, they're important resources in and of themselves, but if they're framed in a more holistic way, these could provide fodder for collaborative research and cross-genre analysis. I imagine a public repository of Kendang Arja recordings carefully categorized by village, by cyclic structure, contextualized in terms of the music, their pedagogical approach, their oral music theories, musicians' lineages, my interpretation of these things. Such a collection might include full transcriptions of improvised sessions, and importantly, it would feature isolated transcriptions of each of the drummers' taught patterns. And with this more complete information packages, researchers from multiple disciplines could then approach the collection from a place of knowledge. So last year, for instance, I worked with an MIT computer scientist named Catherine Young to begin developing genre-appropriate computational analyses of Kendang Arja. Now, this is totally outside my skill set, but with access to my transcriptions and knowledge of the cultural and music theory context, Catherine was able to build upon my research in new ways. And I see really broad potential for a digital sound archive to foster this kind of collaborative or multi-author work across institutions. Those involved in digital transcription could work on recordings I've yet to transcribe. Those interested in computational analysis could build on Catherine's work. Those wishing to analyze microtiming or acoustics or music information retrieval could all use these, but do so in a more culturally informed way because of the contextualization. Were there a user-generated platform linked to the archive, and I know there are space problems with this, other ethnomusicologists studying contrasting styles of arja could post their findings, recordings, transcriptions, taught patterns, musicians' profiles and lineages, oral music theories, and the researchers' own theories and analyses, comparative observations, and all of this would enable an intertextual approach to arja research, where scholars from diverse institutions could access one another's recordings and work collaboratively toward a larger theory of arja. And then if such annotated collections existed for numerous practices worldwide, we could finally engage in a true comparative, cross-cultural, and cross-disciplinary analysis of improvisation. Such archives could be the perfect bedfellows for analytical ethnomusicologists, perhaps creating a surprising black magic all their own. Thanks.